Patrick, Rick, Doblin, welcome to the World Happiness Festival, to the World Happiness Fest. This is amazing because if there is somebody in the world that knows about the state of psychedelics and what the future might be, is you. From an industrial point of view, from a practical and from an essence point of view, Patrick, what you've done is amazing. And Rick, I mean, you are the pioneer, this space in so many ways. So we are all here. I mean, we are dying to learn from your point of view, what is the state of psychedelics and what can we expect over the next months and years?
Well, to start with, at the end of 2021, the journal Science publishes a list of the top 10 scientific breakthroughs of the year in the entire world. There's one winner and 9 runners up. And so the winner was artificial intelligence for protein folding and all of the things that can come from that. But one of the runners up was our phase 3 study of MDMA-assisted psychotherapy for PTSD that we published in May in Nature Medicine. We were shocked to see that. So it's the state of psychedelic research is something that's about to really bloom. It's been kind of underground a long winter, and now we're kind of in the spring. We're moving towards, you said World Happiness Day on the equinox. And so I'd say that the state of psychedelic research is like World Happiness Day. It's like the equinox. It's like we're moving from a long, dark winter into spring. The full flowering of it, I think, will be when near the end of 2023, when we hope that FDA approves MDMA-assisted psychotherapy for PTSD by prescription use. And that will also happen in Israel and Canada, might even happen earlier in England. And we're bringing research to Europe throughout that, Australia, Brazil. I think psilocybin will be a year or two behind that. And then we'll have other drugs like ibogaine or 5-MeO-DMT. So we're at this incredible sense in the world now that mental health has been deprioritized for too much time, and that we really need to acknowledge the burden of mental health problems that is all over the world and is being increased by the anxieties from climate change, from war, from economic inequality, from refugees, from migrants. So I'd say the burden of mental health problems has been increasing, and the slow gathering of data about the therapeutic potential of psychedelic assisted therapy has been increasing. And so I think we're at this turning point where mainstream acceptance, the need is so great that even though there's been the demonization of these drugs and the drug war, there's been vast amounts of misinformation that people had. I think the hope is now just more than the fear. And as far as our particular project, we have published our first phase 3 study in May 2021, and we've accrued 85 of the 100 people in our second phase 3 study. And we think we'll have the interim analysis in May 2022, and we'll have finished the study in October 2022. And we think it'll take about a year after that, if the data is good from the second phase 3 study, to obtain all the regulatory approvals. There's also something that Patrick knows really well, that there's an enormous explosion of for-profit psychedelic companies. So for the longest time, there was just a couple nonprofits, Hefter Research, MAPS, Beckley Foundation, USONA, SAPT, which is a group in Switzerland of psychiatrists interested in psychedelics, but very few and very difficult to raise the funds that we need. Now there's 400 or so for-profit psychedelic companies in all different ways. And there's almost every day, there's media stories. People's attention is really turning to this. And I'm very hopeful that the equinox of World Happiness Day will be the same kind of theme for psychedelics emerging into the mainstream.
Yeah, I like that. I like that analogy. It's a good one. Rick, have you noticed in the previous years, obviously, as the research renaissance blossoms, have you noticed the for-profit psychedelic company revival in the industry being built in real time has positively impacted your efforts in terms of like partnerships or raising money for MAPS?
Well, first off, it's negatively impacted our ability to get philanthropy, because a lot of the people that were donors are now saying, oh, look at all the money that has been flowing into for-profit companies. We'd like to invest. How are you different than for-profit companies? You know, we have answers for that. One of the main things is we're pro drug policy reform. So we want people to be able to buy this even without buying it from us for way less of a price.
Yeah.
And for any purpose. That said, that while it's been more difficult for us to continue with philanthropy, the for-profit companies have also changed the landscape in terms of what people think is reasonable, what's possible. There's going to be a lot more research coming. We are having the world's biggest psychedelic conference ever, which I'd like to work with you guys on as well. The Psychedelic Science 2023 Psychedelic City in Denver, the 18th to the 25th of June 2023. And so we are already getting a lot of interest in the for-profit companies and being in the marketplace and being sponsors of it. So that's been helpful. And we have our first investment vehicle that's not like a venture capital, try to get 10x or anything. It's different than philanthropy also. It's maybe 2 to 3x, and kind of helped announce it at your conference with the Vine deal. And so we've got about 40 of the $70 million of that committed so far. And we think we'll, in the next couple months, hopefully be able to get the rest of the 30 million. And that I don't think would have been quite possible without the rise of the for-profits. We are selling a share of our royalties is what we're doing. So it's not profit, because we're not going to make a profit, because we're going to reinvest it.
All goes back into the company.
Yeah. So we're doing it on revenue, basically.
Thanks.
And so it's helped. I think the other part that's a little concerning is that there's been some examples, lessons learned, we could say, from the for-profit companies that make our model more desirable. In particular, esketamine, approved by Johnson & Johnson as the first for-profit company to make a psychedelic psychotherapy. But actually, it's psychedelic, it's not psychotherapy. So they've approved it as the drug is the thing itself. We received a $5.25 million donation in Bitcoin from an early Bitcoin person who had borderline personality and depression. He went for ketamine therapy, and he had this vision that the way to get out of his problems is to help other people, which is brilliant. And the people that gave him the ketamine said, we don't want to hear what you have to say. It matters nothing. This is just a strict pharmacological treatment. The content is meaningless. Don't even talk to us about it. So the content was super meaningful to him. And after the ketamine, he decided he wanted to help give away a bunch of his money. And he gave this $5.25 million to us because we combine therapy with the pharmacology, with the psychedelic, that they go together. And when you approach it as it's just a treatment by itself, it actually is sort of profit maximizing, in that with ketamine, the results fade. You need more and more ketamine. If you combine it with therapy, it works better, but more money goes to the therapist and people don't need as much ketamine. Yeah. So I think we've learned, and other people have learned too, as well, that really we should ideally, particularly when it comes to mental health, be focusing on what's best for the patient rather than what's the most profit for the company. So that's a good lesson. And I think so many of these ketamine clinics that are run by anesthesiologists and others that don't really understand therapy are going to be replaced over time by clinics where people are cross-trained with ketamine, with MDMA, with psilocybin, and they know how to combine it with therapy, and they focus on what's best for the patient.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. Actually, listening, so much research from the science of happiness came to my mind, because we know that giving and the whole gifted economy is critical for happiness, as well as having meaningful and quality-driven relationships.
Yes.
So when we combine relationships with this kindness, compassion around the essence of giving, that's part of the therapy. And that's part of the setting in many ways in order to do more with psychedelics. So, so this person who gave the donation was completely on track, and we can back everything with research right now. And this is something, Patrick, I want to ask you, because I was at the last conference, and I saw the industry there. Mm-hmm. So I think it was beautiful to see all these researchers, shamans, asking for care of the space, and then the big pharma sitting there observing and getting ready. So I wonder, how do you see this whole space evolving in the coming?
I would say of these 400 for-profit psychedelic companies, there's probably one or two or none that are really branches of big pharma. I think that big pharma is sort of looking around from behind the scenes, but they don't understand psychotherapy. They've largely abandoned this whole area of mental illness and central nervous system diseases. So it's mostly startup pharma. I mean, one of the best names, of course, for one of the companies is Small Pharma, which is one of the new psychedelic companies.
Yeah, they're doing DMP.
Yeah. So I think big pharma, I think, is not trying to block what we're doing, despite what a lot of people say. I don't think it's that way, because their main drugs have gone generic for mental health, and they're really not trying to block us, nor could they if they really even wanted to. But maybe big pharma can get involved, and it costs a lot of money to try to develop new psychedelics. I mean, not really. I mean, Sasha Shulgin did it in a backyard lab in his house and made hundreds of drugs, but and helped rediscover MDMA. But maybe big pharma, through mechanism of action research, can figure out, and there are a bunch of these for-profit companies, small pharma, that are trying to do this as well. But I think we should welcome big pharma if they want to get involved. But we need the nonprofits and the smaller companies to keep the big pharma in check. But I think the more
and I think it's also, like, with them both starting earlier than big pharma in the space, there's a little bit of a chance to kind of collaborate a little bit more openly and actually, impact change on how these things move forward, how they get approved in studies, versus 5-10 years from now, when big pharma comes in and does all the acquisitions. You want those acquisition targets to be in a better, more collaborative state where they're working together for a positive end goal, rather than just, super bottom line value extraction.
Yeah, I like that. The other part too of the slowness of big pharma is that more and more is being put in the public domain, so that they're going to have a hard time using the traditional pharma playbook of patenting everything. And I mean, we see some companies already trying to do that, hopefully not successfully so. But I think that
counter challenges on them.
I think that
can we talk a bit about trauma? Because the way we look at world happiness is more happiness, less suffering, and we know that most of the suffering comes after trauma. But we know as well that there are twice possibilities, as much possibilities to grow after trauma that actually to have PTSD or stress after trauma. So psychology has been really focused on the negative effects of stress. What we are trying is to showcase that actually stress, it can bring a lot of growth, resilience, and adaptability is key to human development. But I know that you are both very interested on the trauma part, which is what I love as well. Is like, how can we help as many people as we can to prevent, to heal, and then regenerate after trauma? So I was wondering, how do you think psychedelics can help in this regard?
Well, we do have a measure called the post-traumatic growth inventory. And a lot of times when people are traumatized, or it's also true when people attempt suicide and fail to succeed, a lot of times they rethink the purpose of their lives, and they try to focus on what they most want to do with their limited time and what they think is most important. So we see this post-traumatic growth as a possibility and an opportunity for people to really refine and reflect their deepest values in how they live their lives. But that requires really healing from the trauma. We see a great number of people who are so beaten down by their trauma that they don't trust people, they don't feel comfortable leaving the house even, or they just feel this web of distrust and suspicion and paranoia around them. So what we've been able to focus on, though, is that we've had some Vietnam vets in our studies who've had PTSD for 50 years or more, and they can still heal. So I think that's what's a really important message, is that you can be burdened by trauma. The world can be burdened by multi-generational trauma from thousands of years, from all this murderous nature of the human species, but that we can still change. We're actually working with Dr. Rachel Yehuda at the Bronx VA, and she's an expert in the epigenetics of multi-generational trauma. And so we're doing a study with the veterans at the Bronx VA, but we'll also be measuring whether we can identify epigenetic changes. If you can heal from your PTSD, will you then no longer pass down certain kind of set points for anxiety and depression, this epigenetic set points, to your children? And we think that we can demonstrate that, so that the burden of trauma that's been coming down the centuries and the millennium may seem overwhelming, but I think within a couple generations, we can kind of metabolize it and digest it. What we would like to do is sort of as a complement to the World Happiness Day and the sort of measures of different countries ranked on happiness, is we'd like to develop a world trauma index. And we have a carbon index. We're tracking pollution, we're tracking carbon, we're tracking happiness. It would be really important to track trauma and see over the next 30, 40 years, or even the next couple of years, once MDMA becomes a medicine and we end up training 25 or 30,000 therapists, and there's 9 or 10,000 psychedelic clinics in North America and elsewhere more around the world, whether we can actually make a dent on reducing this level of trauma at a time when most people think that trauma is just going to keep increasing. We're going to have the climate change stresses, the poverty stresses, the income inequality stresses, the rise of authoritarianism and fundamentalism. And so when people are stressed, a lot of times they sort of fall back into tribalism. So we would like to really focus a lot on this idea of a world trauma index. And the flip side of that is, if you heal from trauma, you can be happier. And if you have a base of happiness and a good childhood, then when you're traumatized, you can work through it. You don't necessarily get stuck and ensnared in it, and then it becomes post-traumatic stress and disorder. We're just actually thinking now of an experiment that we could do in the Ukraine, which is that, for now, for the FDA, that we only work with people with chronic PTSD, because most people recover and are resilient, in part because they have a base of happiness that they can use to kind of help them when they're traumatized. But it would also be interesting to do a study after people have been recently traumatized, like these 2.5 million refugees. And if we could do a large study with like several hundred of them and give them all like one MDMA session, because PTSD requires 6 months chronic before it's called PTSD. But maybe we can test 100 or 2 people, refugees from Ukraine and Poland or elsewhere, with one MDMA session, and then track a control group of the same amount of money over the next couple of years, and see if the group that got the one MDMA session doesn't have as many people progress into PTSD.
It could almost prove it out as preventative medicine, in a sense, instead of waiting for it to get too late and taking, that much longer.
Exactly. Yeah. Now the FDA won't accept that, because they want us right now, at least, to work on chronic. And if we had all the resources that the for-profits have, we could do that. But I do think that a study like that for preventative medicine would be really good. And also, just to mention, is that if we succeed in adults, the FDA succeed means get approval for prescription use for PTSD in adults, which is 18 years or older. We're being required to do studies in adolescents, 12 to 17-year-olds who are traumatized. And then if that works, 7 to 11-year-olds. So you can imagine a base of anxiety in children where they have a hard time to reach happiness colors everything that we're doing. And so if we can, when we talk about insurance companies and cost effectiveness, the sooner, the younger you work with people who are traumatized, the better the benefits are, because they enjoy more life ahead of them to do that. So I think this idea of how can we really, help traumatized children, but also bring them back to this place where they can enjoy growing up and then be energized to try to help make a better world rather than so depressed that they give it up.
Absolutely. And we know that traumatized children are potential totalitarists when they become adults and they become bullies. And so I think that we all know that trauma when you're a child is something that you are going to bring with you for the whole life. Yeah. So I think that if we really want to prevent, and actually I want to build on this index, by the way, we'll be more than happy to become part of the think tank, wherever you want, to think about it. Our goal, as you know, is by 2050, we see a world with freedom, with consciousness and happiness for everybody. But in order to get there, we really have to go into the roots of trauma. So we are completely aligned there.
Patrick, before we go on, could you say, how did you pick 2050?
Well, 2050, we know from the latest reports from the United Nations that we are going to be 10 billion people in the planet. And it takes, from our theory of change, it takes around 25 million people to get to a tipping point. But those 25 million people have to impact on 400 people each. Mm. So when you see how trauma and growth grows and works across generations, you make some numbers, and it might be before. It might be before, but I mean, you know how life is. You set a goal and then you manifest, and then let's see what happens. Yeah. But actually, I know that you have 2070, right? Yes. For something.
Yes, I can explain that. So what I think happens is that 2023, we get approval from the FDA. A year or so later, MDMA is approved in Europe, and then the rest of the world. Psilocybin comes along. So by around 2025, we will really start building psychedelic clinics where therapists are cross-trained in all the different modalities. They customize the treatments for the people. And I think after a decade of that, and you said about how one person can influence 400, we need people to tell their stories. The FDA wants data. They don't want to hear the stories. People don't care about data. They want to hear the stories. And so if we have thousands and thousands of people, we're hoping to have like a million MDMA sessions in this decade, so that there'll be so many people telling their stories that we think by 2035, the culture will have evolved enough not to just talk about decriminalizing psychedelics or legalizing marijuana, but to legalize all drugs, including psychedelics. And we think that'll happen in 2035, sometime around that. And then once that's accompanied with harm reduction, with education about peer support and all, then we have about 35 years or so of the spreading of the use of this and people having worked through their traumas, but also have these deep spiritual experiences that connect them with everybody. And I think it'll take a couple generations of that. And so that's 2070 that I think will have this spiritualized humanity. And another reason I think that is when you look at the Bible and the idea of Exodus and Moses, leading the Jews from slavery, into the promised land. They left Egypt, and it took them 40 years to make it into the promised land. Now, it's not that far. I mean, what has taken them 40 years? And the sort of mystical, biblical, one of the interpretations is that they wanted a new generation born into freedom that would start the promised land. They wanted the people that were born into slavery, that had the slavery mindset, to all die out. And then we'd have these children born into freedom that would start this new world. So I think we will need a base of happiness and a base of this post-traumatic growth enough for a generation or so. And then we could really move into this spiritualized humanity. So I hope that 2050 is more likely than 2070, but we'll see.
Yeah, but honestly, I signed on 2070 as well. So
Well, yes, I think the main
I just
point
hope
is,
I'm alive to be in the
yeah.
States.
Well, I think however long it takes, that's what we have to work towards.
exactly, exactly. So Patrick, I'm curious because you see here a lot of passion for this, but
Yeah.
I've seen you as well, um, uh, understanding very well the dynamics
Yeah.
of the industry. So for microdose, you are at the core of understanding the goods and bads, the people who are here just for money, people
Yeah.
who are here really because we live in it. I was wondering, are we gonna be able to behave in a happy way and in a conscious way, or we are gonna be selling, as we see now with cannabis, jelly bears of any flavor that you can imagine, and chocolate and all this stuff.
Yeah, I mean,
So
I think
I
at the end
wonder,
of
what do you
the
think?
day, it's going to be a hybrid, like with any industry that's been, commercialized or gone mainstream. You're always going to have bad actors. You're always going to have good actors. You're going to have that middle ground. We're already seeing in the industry, like in the public markets, there's a lot of decline in the stocks right now because it just got saturated really quickly and now is consolidating. So that's, part of that is also going to separate the people that are really passionate about doing the work and proceeding and doing it, right, and not just as a quick cash grab or a stock play or anything like that. But I think ultimately, like Rick mentioned, the FDA wants to see the data and people want to see the stories. So, ultimately our goal is to get this in front of as many people as we can through, storytelling, events. We have a magazine, education course, that kind of thing to, really make information accessible and let people make their own decisions. Because, at the end of the day, you kind of have to give people the tools to change their own minds. It's really hard to change somebody's mind for them.
That's a really important point, because in our healing approach to it's that we're the therapists. That's one of the main things we teach our therapists, is that we're not healing people. They're healing themselves. We're trying to create an opportunity for them to heal themselves, because life is going to keep presenting new traumas and new challenges. And if anytime they're challenged, they have to come back to therapy, what have we really accomplished? We're trying to build them, and that's where the happiness comes in. If you have this base of happiness, you can become resilient to future traumas. And so I think we will be able to do that. And I think more and more, as there's examples like that, more and more of the for-profit companies will start acting in that way as well.
Yeah, and I mean, it's also kind of an unexplored territory in that it's medicine for the mind, whereas, a lot of previous depression or, antipsychotic medications, they're, pretty heavy pharmaceuticals with a lot of side effects, where these are proving to be, even just based on your data, more efficacious, lower downside. And if you combine it with, critical skills for people to, learn and grow from, you're helping their foundation. And it's not so much just a Band-Aid fix.
Well, I think that we raised a bit of awareness thanks to this conversation to all our viewers from all over the world. We have more than 80 countries very interested on how we can help humanity flourish. So this is the goal. And I feel that what you are doing is so important. You are really at the center of expansion for so many. So I really want to thank you for everything that you are doing and you are going to be doing. And I think that we are going to be walking this journey together. And the more people really focus on therapy around this topic we can get, I feel is the better for everybody, because that's where we are going to really see the impact. That's my feeling. But thank you so much for joining and raising awareness. And I wonder if you have a final recommendation for the people watching.
Yeah, I would just say that, being grateful for what we have so much, that one of the keys to happiness is just being grateful for all that we have, our freedom, our health, to the extent that we have it. I think that's one important thing. The other is just to say that, we talk so much about psychedelic therapy, but we haven't, and I've talked about the importance of drug policy reform, but the role of psychedelics in celebration it doesn't get as much discussion, like the dance parties, the all night dancing till the sunrise. There's incredible spiritual aspects to that, communal building, working through trauma as well. So I think that when we really have achieved world happiness, we're going to have a lot of all night parties.
I was literally just thinking about that the other night, dancing with a couple friends. I was like sitting there, feeling really happy after a couple long stressful weeks, and I was like, this is medicine. It's incredible. So it's also going to help the culture, and I'm excited to see the mainstream acceptance, and everybody doing the work to help change other people's minds, see where that goes in even just a societal context.
Yeah, and there's one other thing that you reminded me, and I'll just share that I think about the gratitude and the giving. So my wife worked for the World Council of Churches, which is kind of the Protestant Vatican, but they're way more liberal and progressive. And one of the things that they did, they're pretty social change activists, but they're not. They've reinterpreted some of the biblical stories in their own way. And the one that my wife shared to me that they really liked a lot was about Jesus and the multiplication of the loaves and the fishes. And the way it's presented was that this is a miracle, that only some supernatural creature could sort of multiply all the, a few bread and a few fishes to feed 1,000 people. And the church has made this into a miracle, and it's a sign that this is, not a real ordinary human like us. The way that they have interpreted it as that this was shortly after the Sermon on the Mount, around that time. And Jesus gave this incredibly inspiring speech about how we're all together and we're all one family. And then people overcame their selfishness. And then they shared what they had. It's sort of the stone soup kind of story. And then it was enough for everybody. And so that's the real miracle, is how do we help people to be generous and grateful and see us all as one family? And if we can do that, that's the real key to happiness. And that is something that everybody could do. When you turn it into a miracle story, you're like, I can't magically make
one guy can do it,
only with this one guy. Yeah, but when you make it as overcoming selfishness and sharing as the key to happiness, then we can all do that. So I think that I'm really very delighted that you're helping sort of this positive psychology focus on what's possible, not just on healing the wounded, but it's also keeping everybody in a joyous state to be resilient for the challenges.
Yeah, this is I really appreciate all this, and we know that we all are born with wounds.
Yeah.
And at some point those wounds are activated. That's why when you have this theory that we need to start with a clean base at some point of freedom from those wounds and suffering, when we are going to create a base for the next generations, I think I couldn't agree more. So this is very, you're manifesting already something really big, and I thank you for that. So thank you so much, Rick. Thank you so much, Patrick. This is the beginning of more awareness for more people. And thank you again for everything that you do and for joining this World Happiness Fest. We are celebrating 10 years of International Day of Happiness. So thank you so much.
Happy anniversary. Thanks for having us on.